And welcome to our second panel of the day, where we'll be looking at responses to fascism, Jewish responses to fascism in Europe. Let me introduce myself. My name is Jeff Veidlinger. I'm the chair of the Academic Advisory Council here at the Center for Jewish History. And I'm also a professor of history and Judaic studies at the University of Michigan, where I work on the history of Jews in Ukraine. Let me note as well that, that I am a historian of Jews in Ukraine, and the two foreign countries in which I spend most of my time abroad, Ukraine and Israel, are both at war today. And I want to acknowledge that. I know it's been acknowledged already, but I do want to acknowledge that and acknowledge the pain that many of us are feeling right now. May those who lost loved ones in Israel last week be comforted among the mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. May the captives be speedily returned in full health and spirit, restored to full health and spirit. And may the innocents be protected in what is to come in the coming days, weeks, and God forbid, months. I know these are difficult times, and we are here to talk about other difficult times in the past. So let me introduce our panelists today. To my left there is Ken Moss, who is the Harriet and Ulrich Meyer Professor of Jewish History at the University of Chicago. He's a specialist on Jewish history in Eastern Europe and is the author, most recently, of An Unchosen People, Jewish Political Reckoning in Interwar Poland, and the editor also, most recently, of Volume 7 of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization on National Renaissance and International Horizons, 1880 to 1918, a book that I actually just received a copy of, and it really is a magnificent collection of material.
Thank you. Editor with Professor Israel Bartal.
Yeah, co-editor with Israel Bartal, yeah. Thank you. And he is working on a book now, perhaps, called Israel's Future, A History, which I'm sure is changing as we speak. To Ken's right is Professor Michael Brenner, who is Distinguished Professor of History and Seymour and Lillian Abinson Chair in Israel Studies at American University. Professor Brenner has been awarded the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany and was the first recipient of the Salo W. and Jeanette M. Barron Award for Scholarly Excellence in Research on the Jewish Experience. He is the author of 9 books on Israel, Zionism, and Germany, and most recently, the author of In Hitler's Munich, The Jews and the Revolution and the Rise of Nazism. And then to Michael's right is Shira Klein, who is Associate Professor at Chapman University, and she is an expert on Jews in Italy and is the author of Italy's Jews from Emancipation to Fascism. And she's currently working on Jewish participation in Italy's African Empire from the 1890s to World War II. She is also a digital historian and is the author of a very important article on Wikipedia and the falsification of history, and of Holocaust history in Wikipedia. So I'm going to ask them each a few questions. We'll do a few rounds of questions, and they'll each respond in about 3 to 5 minutes, and then we'll open things up to public comment. And for the public comment, if you'd like to write down your questions, you can write those down at any time, and at around noon we'll start collecting the questions. A little bit before noon we'll collect the questions, which I will read from here as we did in the last panel. So my first question to the panelists is, how did the Jews in the location that you study, Italy, Germany, and Eastern Europe, experience the era that saw the rise of fascist movements, essentially experience the era between the 2 world wars? So beginning with Shira.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. And I just want to join Jeff in acknowledging what is happening in Israel, and to add, may all the innocents be spared on both sides, Israelis and Palestinians. So how did Italian Jews experience the era that saw fascism's rise to power? In Italy, Jews' experience of fascism was very much shaped by their class. So Italian fascism rose to power on the backdrop of this depolarization in Italian society between, on the one hand, the working class left, and on the other hand, the middle class right. So the working class was revolutionary. It was inspired by the Bolshevist revolution, and at the apex of working class agitation, which was 1919 to 1920, this was called the Red Biennium, or the Red 2 years, workers went on massive strikes. So they shut down factories for weeks on end. They led land grabs. They disabled the economy for weeks on end as well. And all of these things really frustrated and really scared the middle class. The middle class had a lot to lose, as you can imagine. Unlike workers who had very little to lose, the middle class was paralyzed by this fear, very frustrated with the centrist government for not containing this movement, and they were hoping for some form of authority to come and put an end to this, to what they perceived as this really scary chaos. And enter Mussolini, right? And so Mussolini was very welcomed by the middle class. He marketed himself as the strongman who would deliver the country from chaos. Italian Jews were, in their overwhelming majority, middle class. So they, like others of their standing, opposed the strikes of the working class and were incredibly relieved when they ended, right? So Italian Jews were relieved when Mussolini came to power in 1922, and that the memory of how terrible these strikes had been, how terrible this agitation had been, helped shape their approach to Mussolini in the 1920s. And then in the 1930s, the Italian fascist regime offered various benefits to the middle class, and Jews, not as Jews, but again as white-collar professionals, particularly the men among them, very much benefited from these benefits. So, for example, during the Great Depression in the early 30s in Italy, as wages dropped precipitously, Mussolini's regime was sure to provide all sorts of safeguards to protect middle-class salaries. So if one was a white-collar employee, which most Jews were, or if one was a manager, or if one was a government bureaucrat, then one would be shielded by the government from economic downturns. And Jews, along with other middle-class citizens in Italy, got housing help, they got special benefits, they got travel discounts, they got longer sick leave, and so there are all these perks to being part of the middle class in Italy under Mussolini. And I would say that, in a nutshell, is how Jews experienced the rise of fascism, and of course we'll talk later about what changed.
Great, thank you. Michael?
Yes, of course, in Germany the situation was quite different. Unlike Italian fascism, National Socialism had anti-Semitism as a central element from its very beginning, and Jews realized that. And when I stay for maybe in this first round in the 1920s, before or early 20s and early 30s, before Hitler actually came to power, as you know, Hitler tried to come to power already in 1923. Actually, next month will be 100 years after the failed beer hall putsch in Munich. And it was in the early 1920s that Jews in Germany, especially in the place where Hitler lived and which he used as a testing ground, as I tried to show in my last book, and that was Munich. That's where the Jewish community already experienced in the early 1920s, I would say pogrom-like scenes where they experienced Hitler playing with this weapon anti-Semitism and trying to figure out how would the German population react if he used anti-Semitism as part of his movement, of his ideology. Now, Munich, where this happened first, is of course a very special place also in terms of Jewish history. The revolution of 1918, which overthrew the Bavarian king, resulted in a republic, and the first prime minister of Bavaria was a Berlin Jew and socialist, Kurt Eisner, who was assassinated a few months later. And then there were two some people say Soviet republics in Bavaria, in Munich, in 1919, and almost all of the leaders were Jewish. Hitler was in Munich at that time, and he, at least later, wrote in Mein Kampf that was very decisive for him. Not so sure, but he experienced it and was easy to use. And we've heard that already in the first round, how, of course, whenever the fight is against leftist, communist, socialist, and democracy, Jews are usually part of the mix. So in Munich, that was very central, and that's where this new movement started, and that's how Jews experienced it in the early 1920s, actually with a government that was very conservative. Hitler was not in the government, and that tried twice to expel East European Jews from Bavaria in 1920 and 1923. Munich was a city where already in January of 1923, a movie actually produced in Munich, Nathan the Wise, the parable of tolerance of 18th century German writer Lessing, could not be performed in movie theaters because the Nazis were so strong that they threatened all the movie theater owners, if you perform it, we'll smash your windows, which they did. So it was basically not performed. In Berlin, it was performed with a lot of success. So I would say it also depends where in Germany in the 1920s Jews lived, how they experienced it. In Berlin, in Hamburg, maybe a little less than in a place like Munich or Nuremberg. And then, of course, 100 years ago, the insurrection, the beer hall putsch happened in Munich, and Hitler was, not successful yet. But we all should be careful with failed insurrections. 10 years later, he succeeded. So that's just a little glimpse, maybe also on a local level, at the very stage where Hitler developed his movement.
And Kenya, as we move further to the east.
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind as we think about the experience of the 20s and 30s for Jews in Eastern Europe is that we're dealing with many different countries, tremendously variegated Jewish populations. Leaving aside Soviet Jews, the Jews of Soviet Ukraine and Belarus, we're talking about 5+ million people, 3 million of whom were in Poland, and I'll concentrate my remarks on Poland for that reason. But even within the Polish Jewish community, obviously there was a tremendous range of experiences, just as there were a tremendous range of religious and cultural identities, class sensibilities, politics. So having said that, I think if we had to begin somewhere to generalize, I think it's fair to say that in the interwar period, for Polish Jews and mutatis mutandis for Jews in Romania, certainly Jews in Hungary in a different way, the horizon was one that looked darker and darker, even though in many ways, for much of this time, everyday life could be lived without particular trouble because of one's Jewishness. And I think if we had to sum up that horizon, we would say that a substantial part of the societies, the deeply divided societies around Jews, deeply divided, among other things, over how they felt about Jews, but a substantial part of those societies and a growing part of those societies embraced or were open to the idea, there's a range here, that the Jews, this large community within their societies, were a problem of some sort, maybe a grave problem, maybe a terrible threat to the commonweal of the nation. That was the view of an expanding right. And then, maybe at any rate, some kind of problem. This was linked to many things. These were societies that had tremendous developmental, they were new states ruling over societies that have faced all kinds of developmental problems. These were poor societies with a lot of people living hand to mouth. This got even worse during the Great Depression. In a place like Poland, there were 4 million unemployed or underemployed people out of a population of about 30 million. And in this setting, the Jews of Eastern Europe, quite differently from the Jewish community of Italy and Germany, which were broadly bourgeois Jewish communities, well integrated into generally well-off middle classes, the Jews of Eastern Europe were a much larger population, both absolutely and relatively. So the Jews of Poland, about 3 million Polish Jews, a little more by the end of the period. That's 10% of the population. They were also somewhere around 35 to 45% of the urban population. And they were, on paper, 50% of the so-called middle class, or at least the commercial middle class. Now, when you dig down, the vast majority of those people were not wealthy industrialists. They were desperately impoverished petty merchants. But if you were sort of looking at this as a Jew and thinking, will the larger society allow this to stand, in which we are the urban population, especially as you go further east, in which we are the middle class population, whatever that might mean? There were reasons, lots of reasons to worry that it wouldn't. And I think maybe that's where I'll stop, and we can drill down into the kind of particularities of that in the next question.
Yeah, because you've kind of gotten on to what the next question is about, which is really what the movements, what right-wing, authoritarian, fascist, national socialist movements had to say specifically about the Jews, and the extent to which anti-Semitism was embedded within their ideology or was not embedded within their ideology, and if so, what types of anti-Semitism that was, whether it was instrumentalized or whether it was actually systemic in their ideologies. So we'll go in the same order, starting with Shira.
So in Italy, the history of anti-Semitism has one big watershed moment, and that is 1938. Prior to 1938, Italian fascism did not have anti-Semitism on its banner. There was rampant anti-Semitism in Italy, but it had existed before the fascists came to power, and it came from the conservative right, and especially the Catholic Church. And that was true for earlier decades as well. Right-wingers in Italy, as elsewhere in Europe, fanned stereotypes about a quote-unquote world Jewry, seeped in liberalism, in Russian communism. They talked about Jews as atheists, as Bolshevists, as cosmopolitan, right? Today, cosmopolitan is a nice word, but in a hyper-nationalist Italy of the interwar, it was a really grave charge. And by the way, the irony is that Jews in Italy were as far as possible from communism. There were a handful of communist Italian Jews, but overall, like I said, they tended to oppose this kind of working class ideology. And high-up fascist officials were not immune to this. They partook in the same kinds of accusations. Mussolini himself penned an article about that was full of stereotypes about Jews, speaking about them as the Jewish bankers of London and New York. And then Giovanni Preziosi, who later became Minister of State, published the well-known Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which, if you haven't heard of that, it's this text purporting to be a Jewish plan to take over the world, and in fact it was penned by anti-Semites. But anyway, Preziosi had this translated into Italian, published it, and all 15,000 copies immediately sold out, which I can tell you is the dream of any scholar, right, in this room. But from Italian Jews' vantage point, these expressions of anti-Semitism paled in comparison to what was happening in neighboring Germany. And the worse Hitler was to Jews, right, from 1933 onwards, the worse the policy was, the more Italian Jews blessed their good fortune for being in Italy. 1938 was this big watershed moment because the fascist government did an about turn and started a racial campaign that brought Italian Jews to a situation that was actually very similar to that of German Jews. Almost overnight, Italian Jews could not marry non-Jews, they could not work in various professions, they could not hire non-Jewish nannies, they could not they could not go to the seaside, they could not advertise. You name the restriction, it probably existed. And I will add that Italy was not forced by Germany to take this racial turn. And often people think this was part of the Pact of Steel. It actually wasn't. It predated the Pact of Steel, which wasn't until May of '39. And in any case, the Pact of Steel made no mention of Jews. And Italy certainly drew inspiration from Germany for its anti-Semitic laws, but it also had a homegrown variant of racism that mirrored the already existing racial laws in colonial Africa. So Italy had these race laws in Ethiopia, in Libya, and you see that the anti-Jewish race laws are mirroring both the language and the content of that. And then, of course, in 1943, Italians also played a role in facilitating the deportation of Jews.
Thanks. For Michael, let me actually rephrase the question a little bit more specifically for you, because you'd mentioned Jewish involvement in the revolutionary movements and the National Socialism framing itself as an opposition to the revolutionary movement. So just if you can maybe point to specifically the extent to which Nazi anti-Semitism is utilize political motifs versus racial motifs versus religious motifs, and think about it in terms of that as well.
I would say it's very hard to distinguish because they come very much together. And of course, in Germany, everybody is aware of that. Anti-Semitism was a very crucial systemic part of the ideology of National Socialism. So if the watershed in Italy was 1938, in Germany it was 1919-20. And that's already when Hitler had taken over and renamed the party, now the Nazi Party, National Socialist Workers' Party, and also basically coined a party program that depicted the Jew, as they would say, as the enemy of this newly defined community, the Volksgemeinschaft, the community of the German people, which now was defined as Aryan, and Jews were strangers in Germany. And so that came with the very establishment of the Nazi movement. And of course, to go back to your question, Jeff, it was part of a post-war discourse and of a situation where Germany felt humiliated after the lost war and after being blamed for the outbreak of the war, and a huge economic crisis, and Jews were, of course, not suddenly discovered as the scapegoats. We all know that is a very long history, also in Germany. The very term anti-Semitism was coined in Germany in the late 19th century by a pretty obscure journalist called Wilhelm Marr, and there was, of course, already a racially defined anti-Semitism back then. What was different after World War I is now that Jews, together with others, socialists especially, the left, were blamed that Germany lost the war, the so-called stab in the back legend, that Germany, of course, could not have lost the war on the battlefield. It must have been the internal enemies of the Jews. So this was very prominent already in the very early 1920s, as every single Nazi poster and propaganda piece made clear. I just want to say one last sentence. It didn't mean that every voter who voted for the Nazi Party voted for it because of their anti-Semitism. They might have voted because, they might have voted despite their anti-Semitism, they might not have cared about, but the party leadership did.
Yeah, Ken, go ahead.
Well, I think, once again, it's such a peculiar, it's so different in Eastern Europe that before jumping into the question of the East European right-wing parties, much less the fascist dimensions thereof, I think it's probably most useful to step back and try and give a general picture. And here, I just want to, I don't usually put in a plug for other people's book, but this book by the late, great historian Ezra Mendelsohn, The Jews of East Central Europe Between the World Wars, published 40 years ago, remains, I think, a quite extraordinary place to begin to think about this problem. And one of the things Mendelsohn reminds us of is that, again, from 60,000 feet, if you want to give a generalization, you might say that the political situation in interwar Eastern Europe, with variations in each place, is best understood as a sort of a somewhat authoritarian center, ruling, stretching a kind of thin membrane of quiet over of very divided societies, and facing its most robust opposition from a mobilized nationalist right. There were lefts in some of these places. Poland, for instance, had a meaningful left, PPS socialist left, but seen from the standpoint of East European, of sort of what East European Jews were seeing, they were in many ways in societies ruled by states that were at various junctures taken into the hands of strongmen, but those strongmen were often as not considerably less committed to anti-Semitic politics and to the politics of transformation through, among other things, extruding Jews from society than quite broad-based right-wing nationalist movements. To focus in on Poland, for instance, to focus on fascism, I think, is the wrong way to go. And in a strange way, it sort of is a inadvertently a kind of gaslighting of the Polish situation, because there were fascist elements by the mid-30s. And already by the 20s, there were certainly student elements. The universities, as in Germany, were hotbeds of right-wing extremism. There were fascist elements. There were people fascinated by the Italian case and then later by the Spanish case as a model. But these elements were just part of a much broader right wing that had very varied and often quite minimal interest in fascisms per se, but was very committed to an ethno-nationalist ideal and very full of suspicion turned active hatred toward national minorities, of which there were many, on sort of broad nationalist grounds, and sometimes linked in the Polish case, for instance, and certainly in the Romanian case to very vocal and probably authentic commitment on the part of those same right-wing leaders to religion. Fascism was a kind of a footnote, certainly in Poland, to what is best understood more as a kind of nationalist, ethno-nationalist sensibility. As we kind of dig in a more granular way, we could talk certainly about another point that has to be made too is that in these various places, the quite various Jewish communities had very different kinds of resources for not just resistance, but even for voice. So the Jews of Poland were 10%. They were not a negligible minority. They had access to rights, constitutional rights of speech, although those rights were increasingly diminished. They had access to the kinds of tools that we think of as the tools one needs to fight out a struggle of opinion and the breeding of toleration in the public sphere. At the same time, and much more so than Romanian Jews, much more so than Hungarian Jews, at the same time, I think we want to note that even there, when in 1926 there was a coup from the center that basically created a semi-authoritarian regime, the vast majority of Jews were thrilled and relieved because the trajectory of democratic politics, 1918 to 25 in Poland, was toward the increasing power of the nationalist right. So it's very hard to predict the future, even when you look back on it. But from the standpoint of many Jews, they were at least as worried about what democracy meant in societies riven by deep social problems and shaped by nationalism as they were by anything relating to authoritarianism.
Great, thanks. And I want to now turn to Jewish responses to fascism. And I think in the three regions that we're talking about, there's going to be some difference. In Italy, where certainly before 1938 there was no reason why Jews couldn't belong to the fascist movement, and did in fact. And in Poland in particular, where I think you're right that we can't really speak of a real fascist movement in Poland, but ethno-nationalist movement. There were certainly Jews involved in their own ethno-nationalist movement in Poland as well that I'd like to hear about. And then in Germany, I don't think there were many Jews who were supporters of National Socialism because of the intrinsic anti-Semitism of it, but how they responded in other ways. So to Jewish responses to Nazism, Shira? Or Jewish responses to fascism, yeah.
Yeah. That's right. Before 1938, most Jews did not join the ranks of anti-fascists. So that's a lot of negatives. Did not join the ranks of the anti-fascists. There were some vocal Jewish anti-fascists, like the Rosselli brothers, but really most Italian Jews were somewhere along the spectrum between accepting fascism and supporting fascism, or at most being indifferent to it. And the reason for that, again, goes back to what I mentioned before, the 1920s and this very strong memory of the chaos that preceded Mussolini and this relief at Mussolini's cracking down on that agitation. And then again, the benefits that Jews gained as a middle class But I'll also add that Italian Jews endorsed fascism's imperial designs. And so that very same racial rhetoric that would later be turned on them in 1938, right, when the language and the content of anti-black race laws was harnessed for anti-Jewish race laws, that very same rhetoric was one that Jews mostly accepted in the 20s and in the 30s. In 1935, which was the time when fascist Italy took over Ethiopia, most Italian Jews were really gung-ho about that, very enthusiastic. And then after 1938, Italian Jews mostly responded with shock, disbelief, an insistence that it was Hitler who had twisted Mussolini's arm, that the true Italy would never turn against them, and that it would be fixed soon. And as the years passed and it wasn't fixed, Jews then saw ordinary Italians partaking in this persecution, and then again, as I mentioned, participating in the roundups that led to deportation. People often think that the alliance of Italian Jews with fascism is really counterintuitive, right? And I think particularly people in this country, where Jews have had such a strong tradition of fighting fascism. But I will say that even today, Jews are not immune to fascism. And in my home country, Israel, right, fascist tendencies, as sort of Ruth mentioned before, are rearing their ugly heads. So to the extent that we're speaking about militarism, homophobia, xenophobia, chauvinism, consolidation of power in the hands of the executive, all of these things are happening today, again, by Jews. But to go back to Italy, Italian Jews today, I think, have a deep discomfort about their ancestors having tolerated or even supported fascism. And I'll just end with like a little anecdote that when I did my research in Italy, I did research in a whole bunch of cities. And one of the cities, I was working in the archive of the Jewish community, and the archivist said, before you scan any document over here, you have to get permission for every single document you scan. And that whoever's worked in archives knows that that's a very unusual request, right? Particularly when you're looking at hundreds of documents. And I said, why do I need your permission for every single document? Surely it's enough to just give me permission to look at a certain collection. And he said, can you imagine how people would feel if they saw in your book that you mention, based on this archival collection, that their grandparent was supportive of fascism? Can you imagine how they would feel? And I think that's really illustrative of this discomfort that Jews in Italy have today, right? Where of course we know how things turned out.
Let me just, before going to Michael, let me remind the audience that you can be writing down questions, and we will soon be collecting questions. And for those of you who are watching online, you can also pose questions in the chat function, and somebody in that room over there will write them down and bring them to me, and we can ask those too. So we'll soon be turning to those. Michael.
So when Hitler came to power in January 1933, Jews reacted in different ways. And let me remind you, Jews were surprised as many others. I looked recently at the messages for the new year published in December 1932 in the Jewish newspapers. And there was this kind of optimism. Things are getting better. And the Nazis finally lost some votes in the last elections. And it will be a good year. That was kind of not rarely expressed. But when still in January 1933, the first Jewish museum in Berlin was inaugurated. And even in March, after Hitler was already chancellor, a Prussian delegation came to the Jewish Museum in Berlin to admire the collection of the new museum. So that was the situation. But I would say Jews reacted in four different ways. There was a small fringe of very nationalist German Jews, very right-wing German Jews. I wouldn't say too large a number, but they were also audible. Somebody like Hans-Joachim Schöps, a young youth leader at the time, they would try to say we should somehow collaborate. They knew that they could never join the Nazi Party, but they said, let's distance ourselves from the East European Jews, and we are the true German Jews, and we'll do some kind of collaboration. Of course, they did get no response from Hitler and the Nazi government. The much, much larger group, by far the largest, were the Jews who called themselves liberal German Jews, or often we might call them, to some degree assimilated. And they had, in a way, the hardest time. As Max Liebermann, famous Impressionist painter, expressed it in a letter to Mayor Dizengoff and to Mayor of Tel Aviv and to Bialik, the national Jewish poet, he said, this fate weighs really hard on all of us, but especially on us, assimilated German Jews, he said, who have been dreaming the dream of assimilation, of being just Germans first, and now we have to awake from this dream. So that was already in early 1933. And I think it expresses well this ideology also around the Zentralverein, the Central Association of German Citizens of the Jewish Faith. And they tried with the common means, with the traditional means, to adapt themselves to the new regime. And of course, like many others, they hoped, like many non-Jews too, they hoped that, Hitler's government would go away after a while. And after all, Jews were just 1% in Germany, about 500,000, little more than 500,000 in 1933, so there was no way of actively fighting there and in any successful way. The third part were the Zionists. And the Zionists, in a way said, see, we told you so. Anti-Semitism has always been there, it's strong, and of course their answer was you should go and leave Germany and go especially to Palestine. Interestingly, most German Zionists had not done so before 1933 themselves. Then they told the poor East European Jews, we'll give you money and support you that you can go because you're suffering. But now German Zionists felt that they should go. And the fourth group were the Orthodox German Jews, who, and if you look at how the Orthodox papers reacted in 1933, it was also a very traditional way, First of all, you can find the accusation, it was all the non-observant Jews who brought this suffering because they didn't fulfill the mitzvah. They didn't really live the Jewish lives. And in the end, we'll trust in God and that will help us. So these were, I would say, 4 different modes of different groups of German Jews, how to respond in 1933. As I said, I think by then it was already too late to fight Nazism in a successful way. Maybe the churches could have done it, maybe the unions could have done it, maybe others, but for this 1% of Jews, they just tried somehow either to survive or leave Germany or arrange with the new rulers.
And again, we are collecting questions both in the theater and online. So, Ken?
Let me divide the question up because I think it's worth asking how Polish Jews particularly helped or sought to fight Nazism in Germany. And maybe I can finally speak to the question of fascism rather than pushing it to the side. I mean, there certainly were, first of all, it remains to be just reiterated that until the late 30s in Poland, the regime was not officially committed to extrusionary anti-Semitism. And so we're not talking about a situation remotely like either of these two situations, in the sense that the question of one's relation to fascism is really a relation to one's own government until, again, the late 30s. Here, another thing to say is Polish Jewry, even more than most Jewries, was profoundly divided along ideological lines. There was a robust socialist, Marxist, socialist, anarchist, and also small but much hyped communist left in Polish Jewry, and figures like in those worlds, and some elements on the left, the socialist left of the Zionist movement. The term fascism meant a lot. To come back to points that were made by the panelists of the previous panel, it was a term that resonated analytically for those on and close to the left across the world. And for those figures, they thought themselves to be facing an iteration of fascism. And so, several thousand Polish Jews, almost all linked in some ways to the left, went off to fight in the Spanish Civil War in the International Brigades on the Republican side, as did many German Jews and American Jews. Most often, not because per se they were Jewish, but because they understood this as a front in a single struggle between fascism and republicanism, or fascism and socialism, what have you. Most Polish Jews, of course, did not think that, and nor did they have any obvious way to fight Nazism, but especially right at the very beginning, after the ascension of the Nazis to power, many Polish Jews, certainly it seems like the large majority across the camps, were strongly committed to the idea that they should try and do something, and the something, especially between 33 and 34, which also resonated here in the US, especially in New York, was some kind of idea about a worldwide Jewish boycott. If we boycott German goods, at the very least we'll have a symbolic effect, and maybe we can have a real effect. I think in retrospect it's hard to see how they could have had a real effect, but there was an effort, and it was a very popular effort to, including pressure on Jewish merchants in Poland, small towns, local pressure from friends and family and colleagues to stop dealing in German goods. By 35, that was clearly not going to go anywhere for a variety of reasons. And I think taking a big step back, if we ask a different question, what was East European Jewish resistance, what could it have been to this much more amorphous world of feeling like your future is being foreclosed, feeling like it's unlikely that your kids are going to have a place in this society that they'd want to have, or at any rate, it's less and less likely. What would resistance look like? There were Jews who fought back against various kinds of fascist toughs and thugs and students in the hallways of Romanian and Polish universities, often helped by non-Jewish peers, usually from the left. There was plenty of Jewish resistance to local violence, degrees of which we're still discovering. The historian Kamil Kijek is discovering just how much organized right-wing violence against Jews there was in places like Kielce, Częstochowa, others around 1931-32, and Jews fought back. Sometimes we're talking about fist fights, right? Later on, it was more armed resistance against more dire attacks. But that's not a movement, right? And I think in some ways the real question becomes, was trying to get out resistance, or was it running away? And that's certainly not my place to cast aspersions, those try to get out, but it's worth remembering many Polish Jews would have just wanted to leave, and it was hard to get anywhere. Palestine was an interesting partial exception in 32 to 36. The last thing I'll say is, and to come back to Shira's point, that there's certainly nothing hardwired into Jewish political culture in Eastern Europe that makes for supporting democracy. And I'm not sure I can blame them. Democracy is an essential part of, unfortunately, far right-wing movements in all sorts of places, including Israel today. It's not the natural, eternal enemy of fascism, and I think that's something to remember.
Okay, thank you. Do we have time to do questions?
Yes.
Yeah, we go till 12:15, is that correct? Yeah, okay, all right, great. All right, so there's a few, I can group the questions into a few general categories. I think one of them is historical questions. And the historical questions relate a lot to the situation in Italy, the extent, really they all relate to the extent to which, or somewhat, of Jewish involvement in fascist movements. And then the extent to which in Italy, anti-Jewish laws were imposed as a result of Hitler's influence, or whether they were domestic creation. So that's one. And then Jewish involvement in fascism in all three of the countries. Were there Jews who were involved in fascism in Germany, and Jewish fascist movements in Poland as well? So maybe we'll start with that, a quick round on that. And then the other group of questions has to do with the contemporary moment that we're in. So I'll save that for the next round. So Shira?
So just more on how Jews endorsed fascism?
Yeah, I think there's two different types of questions. So one is, yes, how Jews in Italy endorsed fascism, the extent to which they did, and then the other, the extent to which anti-Semitic developments in fascist Italy were domestic developments or were responses to Hitler's rise in Germany.
Right. I mean, there are all sorts of expressions of Jews supporting fascism. So, as I mentioned, 1935, the conquest or the takeover of Ethiopia generated in Jewish enthusiasm. Italian Jewish women would give their wedding rings along with non-Jewish women. This was called sort of the collection of gold for the patria, for the fatherland. Jews would give money to fascist causes. They would join the military to fight in Ethiopia. Let me think. Jewish children were in fascist youth groups. This was sort of de rigueur, but it wasn't completely, mandatory. But Jewish parents were normally happy to send their their children to fascist youth movements. So these are just a few kind of anecdotal examples. And maybe one thing I'll add that just to provide some new information is even Jews in Libya. There's an interesting phenomenon over there of Jews in Libya endorsing fascism, which is kind of in a way that to me is really surprising. Still working on this is the topic of my second book. But even as this regime is discriminating against colonial subjects, here are these colonial subjects who are helping it and actually going to fight in the Ethiopian War. And then for the second question, Hitler did not, so this is a very common misperception, Hitler did not force Mussolini, or Germany did not force Italy to enact the racial laws, and Italy's racial turn is still being discussed by historians. Some people say it is really an effect of the colonial policies that defined races, and acted on that. And some people say it was more a demographic thing. Some people say it was because Mussolini's popularity had dwindled by then, and so he was in search of a new enemy to rile up Italians to support him. So that is still a question.
Hey, Michael.
Well, in Germany, it was basically impossible for Jews to openly embrace National Socialism because the party controlled who was a member or who would even be allowed in any of their rallies, and you were only allowed as an Aryan. Now, sometimes the question was who was an Aryan. And there are, of course, individuals who have very partially Jewish biographies who wanted to prove themselves, and not only to the Nazi party, but also other very right-wing organizations. I mentioned before that the first Prime Minister of Bavaria, Kurt Eisner, was assassinated a few months after he took office, and that was in February 1919. And his assassin was a 20-year-old called Graf von Arco. Now, Arco was a very prominent Bavarian Austrian aristocratic family, but on his mother's side, she was a née Oppenheimer. So the Oppenheimers were, of course, they were already baptized, I think third generation, important banking family, and he wanted to show to the organization he wanted to belong to, the Thule organization, a very right-wing fascist core group in Munich, that he could belong to by doing this. Didn't help him, of course, but you have cases like that. But Jews were basically not allowed to join any of these organizations. Again, there were some who tried in 1933 or even 32 already to find a way to align themselves, and that all failed terribly.
The East European case, again, is much more complicated. In some sense, it's just as simple in the sense that all of the organized East European expressly fascist, or close enough that within spitting distance, as it were, fascist movements were intensely anti-Semitic, and Jews were not allowed. So the Iron Guard in Romania, the Arrow Cross in Hungary, the so-called Phalangists or the ABC group in Poland, whatever. I mean, they no Jews allowed. So that was an easy answer to the question. Were there Jews on the right, and what does that look like, and were they shaped by fascism, is a harder question, which can't simply be answered by no. And if people are interested in sort of the Polish Jewish case, I think there's a very careful and very intelligent book by my colleague Dan Heller on the Beitar movement, on the youth movement of the Zionist revisionists. So there were elements in the Polish Jewish world who would have called themselves rightists. And let me actually take one step back and say, unlike the Italian case, there were Jewish bourgeoisies who were, broadly speaking, assimilated to the dominant culture. Certainly that defined a good half of Hungarian Jews. It was an important, much smaller but important part of Polish Jewry. But they identified with, I think really universally, the liberal strands in the larger national culture. So that wasn't a path to fascism for anyone. Within the Zionist right, you had elements certainly among the young people. Menachem Begin, for instance, Yitzhak Shamir, those figures, who were certainly impressed by fascist style. You can find photos of them with the bonfires and the uniforms. And I guess in some sense I would refer us back to our first panelists, which if you missed it, you should really see because it's quite important and quite brilliant ways to begin thinking about these kinds of questions too. One essential point one of the panelists made was that one defining feature of fascism is not just readiness to use violence, because people on both right and left in many ways in this part of the world were, but a commitment to the idea that violence is good, it's essential, it's the essence of politics, it's how you build a future. You should yourself take part in it. It makes you a better person, better part of the nation. Those ideas, I think, are not easily found in a very straightforward way in the revisionist right in Poland, but they're there, and you can certainly find elements of them in the revisionist youth scene in Palestine, the mid-30s even, people like Yevin. So we'd have to begin to answer that even more fully. We'd have to think more carefully about what fascism could mean and how it relates, without any kind of hard line that splits it, to a larger world of rightist politics.
Thanks. And then in the time remaining, the larger stack of questions that I have here ask about the current moment, and particularly about perceptions of the rise of fascism in the United States, and what people see as the rise of fascist movements in power in Israel as well. And I think I can summarize the questions with really the fundamental question of what have we learned? And maybe I'll add, that's a difficult question, but what does the future hold? In 2 minutes each. And Shira, we can start with, or do you want to start? Ken, you've got the microphone close to your hand. I can't close to your mouth.
Great, I'll begin, and then you guys can correct everything and put us back on course. I mean, there's no easy answer to the question, what's the relationship between democracy and fascism? And one thing that Shira's case painfully reminds us is that not all fascisms are going to embrace anti-Semitism as their organizing principle. And if that's what Jews are thinking about, they may find themselves saying, I don't really see what's so bad about this regime. It's attacking other people. I think, fortunately, American Jews, at least 80% of them, understand that liberal democracy is not a luxury, it's a necessity. In our setting, and that doesn't have anything to do with the Jewish tradition. I mean, I think I'm very loath to draw direct connections between the interwar experience of East European Jews and American Jewish life. That's not a useful heuristic in so many ways. So one thing you could falsely learn from the East European Jewish situation is democracy doesn't matter. Much better to have a strong leader who can keep things under wraps. I think that'd be a very foolish thing to imagine as being a useful heuristic for thinking about our contemporary situation.
Michael, you want to?
Well, unfortunately, Jews are not immune to fascism. The Holocaust was not a re-education program, and we can see today that there are Jewish followers of movements that at least remind us of fascist tendencies, both in the US and Israel and other countries. Even in Germany, the AfD, this very right-wing party, has its tiny but still a circle called Jews of the AfD. I think most of them are actually like most Jews in Germany today, are of former Soviet background, but it's a small group, but it's important for this party, which is also interesting, that today's right-wing populist parties, I would say in most of Europe and of course in America, try to say that they are not anti-Semitic, And often, you know, some others fall into that trap. I would say anti-Semitism is part of them. It's systemic. But it's very important for them after the Holocaust to say we're not anti-Semitic. And of course, if Israel has a very right-wing government, that helps them. So that's a very complicated situation today, very complicated world. I would still, I always like to end on a more positive note. As Ken said, I mean, it is also, we shouldn't forget that the great majority of American Jews have always voted maybe against their economic interests and have voted more to the left than maybe their economic interests would have been. The same, by the way, as was true for German Jews in the Weimar Republic.
Sure.
I'll repeat what I said before, which is that I think, and I'll sharpen it, which is that I think that the current Israeli government is marching at a fairly steady pace towards, I wouldn't say being fascist, but definitely towards fascist tendencies. Again, you know, if you look at militarism or glorification of the military, if you look at gender roles and the role of women in the public sphere, if you look at the role to approaches towards LGBTQ individuals, these are all people who are excluded by, you know, factions in the Israeli government. And so I think saying that Israel is fascist is, you know, kind of a crazy and fantastical, but I think that it is safe to say very cautiously that we're seeing a surge of fascist tendencies in Israel. And again, to end on a positive note, which is really difficult during these days, you know, and even as I sort of sit here, I'm thinking of my family, so worried for them in Israel. But yeah, I mean, my hope is that one of the things that will come out of these tendencies is perhaps a redefinition of the relationship between American Jews who, like Michael said, have been have such a strong tradition of fighting fascism, and the Israeli government, or, you know, sections of the Israeli leadership who are unfortunately pulling in that direction. So hopefully that's a positive note.
We are just about out of time. Let me just comment on my own that, you know, I've been reading a lot of literature lately, Jewish writings from 1939, and it's really chilling to see the sense of foreboding, but yet the sense of hope that they're not going in the direction that they think they're going. There was talk last week of perhaps canceling the symposium today because of the events of last week, and I think the conversations that we're having really bear testament to how important it is to talk about it and how actually necessary this event is. So we are out of time, but may there be peace speedily in our time in the near future. Thank you.